I was talking about establishing administrative detention under U.S. law, which would require some legislative action. I think that would be unconstitutional. As far as detention abroad is concerned, or the applicability of the Constitution abroad, I once again come back to our international human rights and humanitarian law obligations. The Geneva Conventions, the Torture Conventions, the ICCPR, those are part of our federal law. There's dispute about the applicability of the ICCPR extraterritorially and in armed conflict. I suppose you can guess what my position is on that. It's the position that is the majority position of tribunals and scholars throughout the world, which is that human rights law does apply in armed conflict. It does apply to the extraterritorial actions of states that are parties to the instruments. And so I think the answer to the question of whether or not the Constitution applies abroad is actually the question of whether or not the United States, by virtue of the fact that under its Constitution, international law is part of our law, is obliged to follow its international human rights and humanitarian law obligations in its conduct abroad, and I think the answer is yes.
Okay, Amos, you've got a
double mic. Pierre, with respect to the question of extending constitutional guarantees to non-Americans, I suggest that if we've detained somebody, if we're holding somebody, then we have the obligation to do so. With respect to now detaining somebody, and he says, I hate you, and if you release, bless you, I'll do such and such. I don't, in your paradigm, in your hypothetical, it wasn't clear to me why we detained him in the first place. I mean, I don't think you can detain somebody because he's potentially going to tell you that he hates you. I mean, if he's done something, if he's potentially suspected based either on criminal evidence or intelligence information, that would be cause for detention. But you can't just go detaining people because that just takes us back to where we are, round up the usual suspects. And I would just suggest that there would be no cause for his detention.
Okay, we're going to take one more question. I know Sean wanted to ask one. If we have time, we'll get you over here. Sean?
Thanks. By my count, on the panel, we have a 2-2 split on this question of military versus non-military forum. I wonder, given the history of the military commissions, that really these are creatures of necessity. The first military commissions, of course, were born out of the Mexican-American War, where the military simply found itself in a place where no one else was available to hand out justice. We carried that model through, of course, in the zones of occupation in World War II. With a significant departure, however, in the Kieran military commissions, wherein the Attorney General essentially reviews U.S. law, determines that he has no subject matter jurisdiction, no crime with which to charge these saboteurs, and hands things over to the military. So it's not the case in the Kieran cases that the military was the only justice system going. So on this question of military necessity, could we address whether today the military, the traditional basis for military commissions persists in this conflict? Is it that the military is truly the best or only available option to dispense with justice?
Well, I don't think it's certainly not the only. I was just suggesting that it was a viable option. I think that or it was at least at the outset, there was an argument that these were uniquely military crimes, that they were war crimes. If in fact they're war crimes, then I think then it would make sense to have a military tribunal. But as Sam pointed out, it turns out that what most of what we're talking about is not war crimes, but rather material support to terrorism, which has not traditionally been a war crime. So I don't know that, as you say, that we have functioning other courts that work, and there should be a preference for civilian courts. They certainly would have greater international acceptance, which should be a factor that we think about, particularly where we are trying, foreign individuals and trying to have an international coalition. So that would be my thoughts on that. Anything to add? Okay, our sign says stop. We're available during the break, and
Moderator has the last word.
Yes.